Gather round everyone, it's story time. Get yourself a hot chocolate, get under a blanket, and let's listen to a story. This one comes from Once Upon a Midlife. Classic stories and mythic tales to illuminate the middle years. So let's jump straight in with the Elves and the Shoemaker. Once upon a time, a shoemaker and his wife fell upon hard times. No matter what they did, things went from bad to worse. One day, the cobbler found he had only a small piece of leather left in his shop. The cobbler did not despair, but sat down, cut the leather carefully, and started to sew a pair of shoes. When evening fell, the shoemaker left his work unfinished and returned home to have dinner with his wife. But the next day, the cobbler found a pair of shoes in his shop. Someone had come in during the night and finished his work. The shoemaker sold the shoes and used the money to buy more leather. He spent the day cutting the new material, and when evening arrived, he again put his work away and returned home to his wife. The next morning, the cobbler found several more pairs of shoes in his shop. The mysterious helper had come again, and the new shoes were even prettier than the first ones. The shoemaker sold the shoes, bought more leather, cut it carefully, and left the pieces in his workshop overnight. And the following day, the cobbler found a row of boots and sandals and shoes set neatly on the table. This went on for some time. Each night, the cobbler left pieces of leather out in his workshop, and each morning he found beautiful shoes in his shop. The shoemaker soon prospered, and his reputation for marvellous shoes spread far and wide. And one day, around Christmas, the cobbler said to his wife, "We must find out who is helping us so we can thank them." And his wife agreed. That evening, they hid in the workshop and they waited anxiously. Right around midnight, the shoemaker and his wife heard singing and saw two elves leap through the window. The elves were as naked as the dawn, barefoot and carefree. They danced, they did somersaults, and they sang. And then they sat down, they started making shoes and boots, and in no time at all they had finished their work. They skipped around the room and vanished on a moonbeam. The shoemaker and his wife could scarcely believe their eyes. "Two elves have been helping us," they said. "We must give them a gift to thank them." Since the elves were naked, and since it was the winter, the shoemaker and his wife decided to give them clothes. The shoemaker stitched two tiny pairs of boots lined with fur, while the wife sewed two jackets and two pairs of pants, warm and fleecy. And on Christmas Eve, they set out their presents in the workshop, and they hid and they watched. And at midnight, the two elves leapt through the window and looked around in bewilderment. There was no leather for them to sew and no tools to use. But then they saw the gifts. "Oh!" one elf exclaimed as he picked up a tiny shoe and tried it on. "Ah!" the other cried as he squirmed into a shirt and a coat, and the clothes fit perfectly. The elves admired each other as they danced with glee, and then they vanished into the moonlight. The shoemaker and his wife were delighted, and they went to bed as happy as could be. And the next evening, the elves did not return, nor the night after, or ever again. "What have we done?" the shoemaker and his wife asked themselves. But they were practical people, so the cobbler started working once again. And with a little practice, he made shoes as beautiful as the elves had made, so he and his wife lived happily for the rest of their days. All right, I hope you enjoyed that little story. So before we dig a bit deeper into the story itself, let's just talk for a moment about why telling stories about midlife is actually important, because they're very, very different to stories about youth and childhood. So to quote from the very beginning of this lovely book on page 5, and as always, I'll make sure it's on the screen as well. Middle tales are distinguished by one feature. Their protagonists typically are neither young nor old, are married and earn a living. In real life, these are surely the defining characteristics of the middle years. Middle tales grapple with personal failure, marital conflict, and tragedy. Although most prominent at midlife, these problems are not limited to the middle years, since younger individuals often divorce or face terminal illnesses. Middle tale themes are really ageless. So, with that in mind, when we think about fairy tales, we usually think about it as good versus evil. and there's this big heroic journey, maybe with a clear moral to learn at the end of it. So having been through this life-changing, exciting journey, the hero learns this, whatever this may be according to the specific fairy tale. And that's great for children because the world appears larger than life for them and it's exciting, but it is also simpler. So as we grow up, we realize that most of the meaning from our lives, it doesn't actually come from these grand and noble quests, but instead it's in the everyday things. It's finding meaning through work, or maybe it's settling down to find a partner, or maybe to have some children. Or maybe it's facing a problem that shifts the status quo of your life and you learn to overcome it. The point is that these middle tales, they point us to what it's like to be fully human. So to live in the real world as well as the magical. It's having one foot in each. And personally, I find a lot of inspiration from this idea because it's helping to see midlife not so much as hard work to overcome all of your childhood traumas and difficulties, but to embrace something more. So it's not that childhood presented us with a list of problems and adulthood is just solving them one by one as though it's like some dull checklist that we just monotonously grind through. Adulthood is something special in and of itself. So it can't be reduced to childhood, and it shouldn't be reduced to childhood either. So what we need to do is we need to look at these middle tales for what they are. They're learning what it is to be fully human at this stage of life. And midlife, by the way, or middle tales, they don't apply to just a specific age range. So think about it as when youth ends, but older age hasn't quite begun. And as I've said before, they're about dealing with personal failure and marital conflict and facing tragedy. So that might apply to you in your mid-20s, but for another person, it might be in their late 50s. So I'm intentionally not attaching ages to something like this. But with all this in mind, let's have a look at these elves. So I'm going to quote from page 15, and once again, keeping it on the screen to make it clear. The magic lies in the elves. Their most striking features are that they are naked and wholly uninhibited. Innocent and playful, they are not yet burdened by social conventions or self-consciousness. They personify the carefree spirit of youth and childhood, and the disappearance of the magic elves symbolises the inevitable experience of growing up, surrendering play for work and innocence for responsibility. So there's a really clear difference between childhood and midlife, in case it wasn't already clear. And that chapter, it goes into good detail on the specific elements of that story as well. So, for example, the elves, they enter the story naked and innocent and playful. They don't see anything as wrong. They're just doing what they do, and they're having a good time doing it. They're in the flow. They're not overthinking things. But the wife sees this, and although it might seem like a nice thing to do, her first thought is to clothe them as a way of saying thank you. And the author does say directly, clothing reflects social decorum and conventional behaviour. In giving the elves clothes, the cobbler and his wife symbolically try to socialise them. And this is a common theme in a lot of these tales. Instead of being able to see the world in a carefree and innocent way, instead it's seen through the perception of responsibility. So it's, how can I improve this or that, and what should I do or not do? It's not, how much fun can I have simply for the sake of it being fun. And shoes especially, let me just find that picture. So shoes especially, and clothing more generally, they've got a big symbolic meaning in a lot of these stories. They usually represent things like labour and work ethic and practical matters and fitting in with society or the role that you have to play. Whereas if you compare that to the elves in the story or other magical creatures in others, they're usually barefoot, which typically links with things like innocence and a carefree attitude or maybe like naivety. But just to make this clear, this isn't a failing. It's not a problem to be fixed. The loss of magic is a developmental issue. It's not an ethical one. So as you grow up, there's a natural trade-off of naivety and innocence for purpose and responsibility. And that's not a punishment. It's just the natural evolution of growing up. And for me, that's what makes these middle tales so interesting. They're quite ambiguous, and the meanings, they sometimes seem quite strange at a first glance. So like in this story, the elves leave, and the cobbler just gets back on with his wife. And life improves, and he learns to make beautiful shoes for himself. So just to quote from page 17 on this, after the magic of youth comes work, The Shoemaker does not lose the elves' magic so much as he transforms it into his own skill and discipline. And that is what is important. It's the transformation. It could be viewed in one way as a punishment or a tragically sad story, but instead it is the opposite. It's a recognition that as we become more aware and more conscious, we can gain more knowledge, and this might destroy the magic of youth, but it's also an opportunity for creativity. So just on a wider scale for all this, I've designed the flow of lessons to show how these books all link together so that you can take on this transformation for yourself. So another way of saying this is we need to identify the needs of the child within and see what they've left behind in youth. That was the previous lesson in this little flow. And then that gives us access to the shadow side of our personality. So we can learn how to identify these specific values and traits and characteristics so that we can start working with them to integrate them into our personality, or to transform them is another way of saying that. And then rather than being sad and mourn these certain aspects of ourselves, instead we can learn to get our own needs met. And then we go on this journey of self-actualization. And we can see how our lives need to develop externally to fit in with society, but also how and why we still need to access this inner depth. So finding inner meaning and fulfillment, as well as outer success, which is what we covered in this book, The Unfolding Self. And this comes with slowing down, and it's accepting a certain amount of voluntary simplicity, where we focus on the things that matter and we cast aside all the things that don't. So that's why timeless simplicity came into it all. So as we're looking at this, that takes us then to midlife, when we're able to look at all this material and decide what we can creatively do with it at this stage of our lives. And although I'm talking about the loss of magic and elves and all kinds of fairy tale things, we can probably all relate to these meanings on an everyday level. The elves, they represent this boundless energy and possibility and playful youth, and the cobbler and his wife, they're a lot more practical and they're focused on their roles and earning money. The elves can be seen as our conscious side of our potential, and the cobbler and his wife are more of the conscious personalities. And that's made even clearer by the fact that the elves sleep at night and do their work while the cobbler is sleeping. So how often is it that we've struggled with a problem consciously only to sleep on it and then wake up with an answer? So we let our inner elves do the magic while we rested. And then we wake up and the inner elves, they disappear and they leave behind their gifts. So in the case of the story, some shoes. Or in the case of our everyday lives, whatever problem we'd set them to work on. So sometimes to be creative, we need to keep our conscious mind busy or occupied because it just interferes with the creative process. And there's a reason why we often have great ideas when we're in the shower or go on a walk or while we're dreaming. It's because we let the unconscious mind take over. So if you want to be a bit more whimsical, it's letting the elves take over while the cobbler sleeps. So let's bring all this back together with one final quote on creativity. I'm taking this from page 20, where the author is talking about two different types of creativity. The first he describes as hot from fire, where a creative work, whether a sculpture, a novel, or a musical composition, appears fully developed in the artist's mind. The second type of creativity then comes to the fore, sculpted creativity. The artist begins with an incomplete inspiration and then works and reworks the idea. If youthful creativity is 99% inspiration, mature creativity is 99% perspiration. Magical elves become steady cobblers. And this is the transformation that I was talking about earlier on. We don't want to see the elves as only creative and the cobblers as only practical. We need to learn how to see that the elves can be practical on their own terms and how the cobblers can be creative on their own terms as well. So what we need to do with all this is just realizing that this transformation is in that realization that it isn't about being creative or practical, but being creative and practical. So in Jungian shadow work language, it's not the persona or the shadow, it's the persona and the shadow, the outward facing personality and the inward facing personality. the objective outer world success and the subjective inner world fulfillment. And I really, really love that phrasing as well. Magical elves become steady cobblers. For me, that's really hopeful. It's very inspirational. And through doing all this work, the inner child and all of our potentials that come up from our childhood, they can become healthy and mature, actualized aspects of ourselves. And it's a transformative process. It might start with inspiration first and then become perspiration to see it happen, but that doesn't mean it's any less creative. And all of this, by the way, is just from one story in this book. There's another 15 stories in it from all around the world. And some of them are quite simple, some of them are a bit more complex, but they revolve in some way around the theme of helping adults to face issues around midlife. And just, I love that front cover as well. I've not even mentioned that. Oh, it's absolutely beautiful. So, for those interested, the 4 bigger themes that these stories fall under are settling down, reversals of roles, common crises, and reconciliation and renewal. So if you are interested, I would definitely recommend this book. But I'm going to leave it there for this one, and I will see you in a future lesson. See you then.